In order to successfully print a part, you'll need to make sure that the machine is prepared properly. One of the most important areas to prep is the build plate. Since the first few layers of a print are the most important, the build plate should be prepped so that the surface allows the material to adhere to it. You'll also want to make sure that there aren't any objects obstructing the build area. Loading the material is also an extremely important process. FDM printers need to have the spools attached and oriented correctly, along with the strand feeding evenly into the extrusion nozzle. SLA printers need to have sufficient amount of resin remaining in the cartridge, and that there aren't objects floating in the resin tank prior to printing. Once these are prepped, the access doors can be covered, guards put in place, and check that the build area is clear. From there, you can begin printing. The build plate is one of the most important areas to prepare on a 3D printer. There are a couple different methods depending on the type of machine you're using. When using an FDM printer, the build plate is most often made of glass, which is the most common practice with current generation machines. Due to the smooth nature of glass, the addition of some sort of adhesion material will aid in making sure that a print will stick to the build plate. Some suggestions for materials to use on the build plate include blue painter's tape, hairspray, or the use of a glue stick. Because the adhesion of the first layer of an FDM print is so critical to the successful completion of a print, it's highly suggested that one of these methods be used. In the case of using an SLA printer, it's best to make sure that the build plate is clean and free of debris, and that the resin tank is clear of any foreign objects that may disrupt the path of the laser. Loading the print material is another important aspect of preparing the machine. There must be enough print material present, and it needs to be loaded properly. Loading material into an FDM printer will vary by manufacturer, but the most common steps will include mounting a spool holder and then attaching the spool. Be sure to orient the spool the correct way, which means that the strand of material feeds smoothly into the guide without any kinks. If the spool is oriented correctly, it will rotate easily on the spool holder and allow for an even feed into the extrusion nozzle. Additionally, be sure to handle the spools of the material in a way that the strand doesn't overlap and get tangled around itself before attaching it to the machine. This could bind the strand and keep it from feeding into the printer. In the case of this Dremel machine, you'll need to remove the access cover and then manually feed the material into the guide tube. At that point, you can run the material load function on the printer to conclude the process. With this Ultimaker 3 printer, the spool holder needs to be mounted and plugged in, and the spool end holder should be used to keep the spool on the machine. The Ultimaker spool holder includes an NFC reader which can transmit the material type, color, and diameter directly into the machine and into the slicer software. Once mounted, you feed the material into the feeder here, and then complete the process on the machine interface. In the case of most FDM printers, once the machine has successfully started extruding material through the nozzle, it's best to let a little bit of material flow out to ensure that there aren't any clogs. You can also watch to make sure any previous material has flowed out in the case of a color change. With an SLA printer like this Formlabs Form 2 printer, you can always add additional resin once the installed cartridge runs out. An SLA printer will first need to heat up the resin in the build tank prior to starting the print. This is an automated process that will take place once you begin a print. In the case of most modern printers, they will allow you to pause a print should it get close to running out of material. Then the machine can be refilled with additional material, whether it uses a spool or a resin cartridge. Once the build plate is prepped and the material is loaded properly, you're ready to begin printing. You'll want to make sure that all the access doors are closed. Not every machine incorporates safety switches when beginning to print. It's also a good idea to make sure the printer is placed in a well-ventilated area, especially with SLA printers, since the heated resin can produce a noticeable smell.